Hi everybody. I know it's been a bit of a strange week for all sorts of reasons, but this is week 1, lesson 4 for everybody. This is applicable definitely for year 1. Year 2, I know life is a little bit all over the place with regards to what's happening with your exams. Those questions will be answered. I have as many questions as you do. I'm anxious about it as well, and I know it's really awful, but we just have to wait for news. And maybe if you just need to pass the time, you can listen to my YouTube videos anyway. So today we're going to talk about exam technique with regard to changing places questions. Before we look at any changing places questions, we're going to just remind ourselves of a few basic bits to do with exam technique. So in EDUCAS, your exam board, there are 2 types of question, and they are recall and application. So recall are the short questions. They might be 2 marks, 3 marks, 5 marks, and it's basically just asking you what you know, what can you remember. That means those questions are points-based mark schemes, i.e. if it's a 5-mark question and you manage to come up with 3 correct points, you will get 3 out of 5. All right, so it's fairly straightforward for you and also for the examiner. Those questions are divided into part A and part B, and they require a slightly different approach, which will make so much more sense when we look at some actual examples. Point A questions are resource-based. You might be given a graph, a map, a photo, a newspaper cutting, a table of numbers, anything really, and you are asked questions about it. And then the part B is where you need to use your A-level geography knowledge. So the approach is quite different and will make more sense in a minute. Then you get longer questions. So in changing places, the maximum number of marks is 15, but anything over 6 up to 15, you need to think about the answer. It might not be immediately obvious. You might have to kind of work it out in your head, and that is marked in a very different way. It's levels marked, so your examiner has to read the whole of your answer and then decide which level your answer kind of matches. And they take loads of things into account for that. Your structure, your use of case studies, and so on and so forth. Okay, so one of the things we will continue to work on over the 2 years is your completely different approach to different types of question. As you can see, this PowerPoint goes through lots of stuff. This is the only other slide I wanted to talk about briefly. Most of you know that I really struggled with exam technique when I did my A-levels. It's something I've sort of really had to work on. I'm not saying this will work for all of you, but basically I've distilled all of the work and all of the advice I've been given in my long time of learning to this. Some of it is geographically specific, some of it is not. So it's really important that you read the whole of the question. We tend to skip the very beginning of a question and skim read it, and we can miss out really important detail. So read every single bit of the question. Look at the resource. Don't just kind of pay passing attention to it, because particularly for the part A questions, you really need to look at the resource. Find the command word. If you were in the army and you were commanded to do something and you didn't do it, you would be in serious trouble. Kind of try and think of it like that for your exams. If you are being asked to describe, you must describe. If you're being asked to evaluate, so it's really important over the 2 years that you get to know the different command words and what they want you to do. Trip hazards, what are they? Trip hazards are not going to be in every single exam question, okay? They're in some of them, not all. And the example I've given you there is process or processes. Let's say you were asked something about, just talk about coasts, because that's in my mind, because that's what I've got to teach you next week. Describe 2 coastal processes that you have learned. That's a bit too simple, to be honest, but that's the best my brain could come up with. you then need to do processes plural, not process singular, to be within any shot of getting the marks. So trip hazards are quite subtle, and then, as we've already discussed, your approach to the question needs to depend on how many marks it is. Okay, let's now have a look at some actual questions and see if we can make sense of them. Okay, so this is in your module booklet. Now, depending on whether you're year 1 or year 2, it might be a slightly different page number. Let's go with, sorry, trying to get this right, there we are. On this year's module booklet, it's page 82. For year 2 students, it might be a slightly different number. Okay, so here we have some changing places questions. So, applying my own advice about what I've told you, I'm going to read the question from the very beginning. Figure 3, changing location quotients of high technology sectors in Boston, America, 2004-2014. High tech, we're talking about quaternary sector, we're talking about the knowledge economy. It's talking about the fact that, is that to do with changing location of them over a 10-year period between 2004 and 2014, okay? And then I look at the graph and I see that I've got different coloured bars for the years, and I can see that the high-tech sectors have been divided up into different categories. So do you see what I've done? I've read the beginning of the question and looked at the resource before I've read the question, and I think that's really quite good practice. It's quite hard to do in an exam when you're anxious and panicky, but it's quite good practice if you can discipline yourself to do it. Okay, so let's have a look at our question. 9A. So remember, this is going to be a resource-based question. This is going to be no A-level geography knowledge required. Okay, use figure 3, okay, to describe. That's my command word, and describe is say what you see. I'm not saying why, I'm saying what. Describe changes, okay, in the concentration of high-tech sectors in Boston from 2004 to 2014. I've got 5 marks. Have I got any trip hazards? Well, I don't think so. My command is describe. It's 5 marks, just get on with it. I've got to try and find 5 different things to say. And what I would then do is I would be scribbling on this graph or highlighting. And I would be trying to find the sectors where there was a massive difference between the bars. For example, if you have a look at computer and electronic product manufacturing, the change between 2004 and 2014 is huge there. There are some much more subtle differences. Data processing and related services is a much more subtle difference. Generally speaking, I'm looking for patterns between whether the orange bars are usually longer than the green bars, and actually it's interesting, isn't it, because there's a bit of a mix, so I'd be talking about those kinds of things. That's what you do for a part A question. I don't need to have learned A-level geography in order to do that, because I'm just describing a graph. That's the important thing about part A. Part B, immediately I've got to switch on my brain, I've got to remember stuff I've learned. Outline. Outline is my command, and that's key points only. Outline how quaternary industry clusters may have an impact on the population and global connectivity of one or more places. Okay, so I can do one place, that's fine. I was worried about clusters, but it does say one or more, and that is genuinely a free choice, it's up to you. But there are 2 jobs to do, that's the trip hazard. An impact on the population and global connectivity. And quite often when you have an exam question with 2 jobs to do, students will do one or the other. So that's the trip hazard in that question. You've got 2 things to do. Okay, so quaternary industry clusters have been the subject of some of my YouTube videos. That's going to be to do with job creation, multiplier effect, increased traffic, increased house prices, that sort of stuff. That's how the people are going to be affected. Global connectivity. So the quaternary industry is the knowledge economy. It relies very heavily on global connectivity of people, of technology. So if you start to get more quaternary industry, you are going to see global connectivity increase. That, however, is part and parcel of a much bigger process called globalisation. So depending on how confident you were, you could almost have a little bit of a discussion about, are they more connected than other places? Because actually globalisation is the increasing interconnectedness of everything, and maybe it would just be happening anyway, that sort of thing. We do 3 case studies. We do Cambridge Science Park, which is your main one, Bangalore and Bath and Bristol for their creative cluster. You could either focus on one of those, or you could mention all 3 of them, or 2, whatever. But because it's 8 marks, we do want a little bit of case study stuff. What would our weigh-in be? So when I talk about the weigh-in, it's sort of an introduction, but all I'm trying to get my students to do is not repeat the exam question. I think there are much better ways to start an exam answer. And I think here I would be defining what the quaternary sector was. So I'd be saying something like, the quaternary sector only appears in more developed countries towards the end of the Clark-Fisher model. It's a sector of the services, but it is much more high-tech, or something like that. That would be my way in. Okay. Then we get to the 15 marker where we really need to show off our knowledge. Examine. Examine is, if I said to you, examine that rock, you might not be thrilled by that prospect, but the idea is that you would look at it in a really detailed way, that you'd like, not just look at the rock, examine the rock, have a really detailed look. Examine how deindustrialisation, so that's the loss of your secondary sector, can have varied consequences for urban places. Okay, command is examine. Trip hazard, places, plural. We can't just talk about one. Weigh in. What is deindustrialisation? Define that as your first sentence. What you're then going to have to do in your main body is you're going to have to talk about the spiral of decline and how it seems to have affected our 3 case studies slightly differently. When we talked about Bridgewater, we talked about a whole host of problems that have been created by the spiral of decline, including lower aspirations among students, so we get lower GCSE results, we had increasing levels of deprivation, that sort of thing. When we looked at Detroit, we massively focused on the issue of depopulation, vacant buildings, all that kind of thing. And when we looked at Glasgow, we looked at the effects on people's health and poverty. So the whole point of doing the 3 case studies was to give you varied consequences. And if you went through the case studies and looked at the varied consequences, you would be really nailing this question. So do you see, yes, of course, you need to know your geography and you need to revise it, but actually your exam technique is half the battle, because if you do what the question is asking you to do, and you know how to approach a part A and a part B, and you know that a 15 marker needs case studies, etc., it really begins to start to see your marks beginning to increase. Okay, so what's going to be happening next week? For year 2, as we've said, we're not sure, but we're not going to worry about that. We're going to deal with the information when we get it. For year 1, I'm going to start teaching you coasts next week. Some of you have module booklets, some of you don't. We'll deal with that as and when we can. There is an electronic copy that I have emailed to all of you, so that is at least better than nothing. But as I've done this week with my videos, you'll be able to see the PowerPoint I'm referring to on the screen anyway. Okay, enjoy as much as you can the next couple of days, ladies and gents. See you next week.